There is a man dying on a piece of wood. He is suffocating, slowly, the way that particular kind of execution was designed to make a person suffocate. His arms are stretched. His lungs are failing by inches. He has maybe minutes of clear thought left, and every one of those breaths costs him something no healthy person can imagine paying. And with some of the last coherent words he will ever speak, he stops to make sure his mother will have something to eat. Hold on to that man. We are going to come back to him, but not yet, because to understand what he was doing in that moment, why a dying man would spend his final strength on a household arrangement, you have to go back more than 1,000 years, to a mountain in a desert, and to a single word that almost every English Bible gets a little bit wrong. Here is what most people miss. 9 of the 10 commandments arrive with no reward attached. Do not steal. Do not murder. Do not carve idols. No promise, no incentive, just the line drawn and the expectation set. But the 5th one shows up carrying something the others don't. Honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. Long life, land you get to keep, a reward dangled right there in the sentence. And that's a strange thing to dangle in front of a child. A 7-year-old does not lie awake worrying about whether he'll still be around in 40 years. He doesn't own property. He can't lose a family plot because he has never held the deed to one. Whatever else is happening in that verse, the reward is aimed at somebody with enough life behind them to worry about the years ahead. So who was actually standing at the base of that mountain? Not children, grown men and women, herders with flocks, heads of households who had walked out of Egypt with their elderly parents leaning on their arms for the entire journey. People with land coming to them, land they had not yet set foot on, land they could already imagine losing. The other 9 commandments assume an adult if you stop and look. Small children don't generally carve idols, plot murders, or give false testimony in a property dispute. The whole list speaks to people old enough to do real damage, which means the 5th one does too. This is not a rule about children. This is not a rule about manners. This is not a rule about saying the right words at the dinner table. This is a command spoken to grown adults, holding the future of a nation in their hands, about what they owed to the 2 people getting older in the back room of the house. And the word at the center of it, the word we translate, honor, is heavier than you think. Much heavier. The Hebrew word underneath it has almost nothing to do with politeness. It's a word about weight. Real, physical, pressing down on you weight. And once you see what it means, you cannot unsee it. It changes the commandment. It changes what Jesus said about it. And it explains, finally, what that dying man was doing with his last honest breath. Stay with me, because we're about to weigh a word. 40 years after the mountain, Moses says it again. The first generation is buried in the wilderness by now. A younger one stands at the edge of the Jordan, about to cross into a country they've never lived in, and Moses runs through the 10 commandments one more time. When he reaches the 5th, the wording shifts, just slightly. Honor your father and your mother, as the Lord your God commanded you, that your days may be long, and that it may go well with you in the land. He adds a phrase, not just long days, but that it may go well with you. Length of life and quality of life, tied together, handed to a generation about to divide up a homeland by family, plot by plot, clan by clan. But it is the same central word both times. And that word is where everything turns. The Hebrew is Kabad. And its root has very little to do with saying yes, ma'am, at the table. At its core, Kabad means heavy, weighty, something with mass, something dense enough that you cannot casually shove it aside. Watch how the Bible uses it when nothing spiritual is going on at all. When Genesis says the famine was severe in the land, that is this root, the hunger was heavy. When Moses stands at the burning bush and tries to talk his way out of the job by saying he is not a good speaker, the Hebrew literally calls him heavy of mouth and heavy of tongue. When Pharaoh hardens himself against Israel, his heart is described the same way, weighed down, immovable, too heavy to shift. And it even shows up as a plain description of a body. There is an old priest named Eli near the end of the book of 1 Samuel. Word comes that the ark of God has been captured, and the shock of it kills him on the spot. The text tells us he fell backward off his seat and died, and it notes, almost in passing, that he was old and heavy. Same root. No metaphor. Just mass. A heavy old man, tipping off a chair at the worst news of his life. Now here is where it gets remarkable. Those same 3 letters give Hebrew one of its most important words for God himself. Kavod, glory. When Israel talked about the glory of God filling the tabernacle, the presence that came down, so thick the priests could not even stand up to do their work inside it, this was the word they reached for. God's glory is his weight, his substance, the sheer, undeniable there-ness of him. Not a glow, not a mood, a presence so real it presses down on the room, and grown men had to back out the door. So sit with what that means. When the commandment says honor your father and mother, it is borrowing the exact language Israel used for the crushing, holy presence of God and pointing it at 2 ordinary people. The 2 people, most likely, that you argued with over dinner, which makes the command concrete. Give your father and your mother weight. Let them press down on your decisions, your speech, your calendar, and where your money goes. Let them count for something heavy. And now watch what sits on the other side of the scale. The opposite of kabad in Hebrew is a verb called qalal. It means to be light, slight, trivial, to make something so weightless it could blow away in a breeze. And qalal is the exact word that shows up a chapter later, in a line that stops you cold. Whoever curses his father or his mother shall be put to death. Our English word curse makes us picture swearing, shouting something ugly. But the Hebrew is quieter than that and colder. It does not mean to scream at. It means to treat as nothing, to make a person light enough to blow away. 2 pans on one scale, heavy on one side, weightless on the other. And Israel was told, in no uncertain terms, which side to load. That death penalty belonged to Israel's civil law, as a covenant nation, the way every ancient legal code carried its sentences. Nobody was handed it as a personal license to go enforce. But here is what it tells you loudest. The God of Israel took contempt aimed at a parent with deadly seriousness. To make your mother weightless was not a small thing. It was a capital thing. This is also why the commandment cannot simply be swapped out for the word obey. Hebrew has perfectly good vocabulary for listening and obeying, and the 10 commandments do not reach for it here. They reach for weight instead. And weight, unlike obedience, does not expire when you turn 18 and move out. So think about what that weight looked like in flesh and bone. Think about Abraham. When Sarah dies, the very first thing he does, a wandering man who owns almost no ground in the entire country God had promised him, is buy a cave. The cave at Machpelah. He haggles. He pays full price. He refuses the discount they offer. Also, his wife can be buried in earth that belongs to him, in a grave that will stay in the family for generations. That is treating a person as substantial even after they can no longer do a single thing for you. Or think about Jacob, an old man dying far from home in Egypt, who makes his son swear an oath before he will let go. Do not bury me here. Carry me back. Lay me with my fathers in the cave that Abraham bought. And Joseph, the second most powerful man in the most powerful nation on earth, keeps that oath at staggering cost. He leads a funeral procession the entire length of a country, from the banks of the Nile all the way to Hebron, dragging the machinery of an empire behind a dead shepherd, just to lay his father in the ground his great-grandfather had paid for. That is the 5th commandment operating centuries before anyone carved it into stone. Land, burial, name, the honoring of the old, one braided thing. Pull out any single strand, and the whole household unravels. But here is the part nobody tells you about that weight. It was never mostly a feeling. It was a matter of survival, and not just the parents' survival. Everyone's. And to understand that, you have to walk into an actual Israelite house and do some very hard math. Quick word before we do. If you value deep Bible studies like this one, subscribing helps us keep making them and keeps them free. To everyone already supporting the channel, thank you. Now, the hard math. Strip out everything modern for a second. No pension, no retirement account, no insurance, no assisted living on the edge of town. No check landing in the mailbox on the 3rd of the month. In the ancient world, and across the entire region surrounding Israel, an old person survived for exactly one reason: their adult children fed them. That was the whole system. There was no second safety net underneath the first, because there was no first. Grown sons and daughters were the net. And if they let go, the old fell all the way to the ground. Historians who work with legal documents from the ancient Near East find this spelled out in black and white. Contracts naming which child owes food, oil, wool, and shelter to an aging parent. Enforceable, itemized obligations. In some places they find adoption agreements drawn up for exactly this purpose, a childless couple legally adopting an heir so that somebody would be bound to care for them at the end of their lives. Read enough of these, and the truth settles in. In that world, honoring your parents was less a warm feeling than an economy. A ledger, a question of who eats and who does not, which reframes the whole commandment. God was not handing out a rule about being nice to mom. He was writing law for a society where the treatment of the old was, quite literally, the difference between an elderly person living and starving. And this is where the difference between two English words starts to matter: honor and obey. When Paul writes to the church at Ephesus, centuries later, he keeps the two ideas apart inside a single paragraph, and once you see it, you cannot miss it. First he says, "Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right." Then he shifts and quotes the commandment itself: honor your father and mother. Two different instructions, side by side. Obedience belongs to a season, the years when you are under their roof and under their care. It has an expiration date. You grow up, you move out, and a 40-year-old woman does not owe her mother obedience about which job to take or whom to marry. But honor never expires. The obeying ends. The honoring does not. And here is the part nobody tells you. The honoring gets harder right at the point where it matters most. Listen to how the book of Proverbs frames it. Listen to your father, who gave you life, and do not despise your mother when she is old. Look at that second half. When she is old. That is the pressure point, and the writer knows it. Nobody despises a healthy, capable, contributing mother. The temptation arrives later, when she is confused, when she repeats the same story for the 3rd time in an hour, when she needs help getting up out of a chair, when caring for her starts costing you time and money you would honestly rather spend on almost anything else. That is when weight gets heavy, and the Bible is not gentle about the people who drop it. One of the most disturbing images in all of Proverbs lands on the person who sneers at a father and refuses a mother, and it involves the ravens of the valley coming for the very eye that did the sneering. A grotesque picture, on purpose. Ancient Israel treated contempt for a parent as a threat to the entire community, because a society that quietly discards its elderly has already decided something monstrous, that a human being is worth only what they can still produce. And a people who believe that are already, slowly, eating themselves. Stay with me, because there is one more line worth sitting inside before we go further. The book of Leviticus, chapter 19, opens with God telling Israel to be holy, because he is holy. Then comes the very first specific instruction of the chapter, the opening definition of what a holy life looks like, and most readers skim right over it. Every one of you shall revere his mother and his father, and you shall keep my Sabbaths. Two things, set side by side in one breath. Reverence for parents, and keeping the Sabbath. One command about people, one command about time, welded together as the front door of holiness. And notice the wording, mother first. In a culture that almost always said father first, and does say father first back in Exodus, Leviticus flips the order. Ancient Jewish commentators noticed that reversal long ago, and many read it as intentional balance. Whatever weight a father carried in that world, the text refuses to let a mother count for even a little less. But the pairing with the Sabbath is the part one want you to feel, because those two commands are secretly asking the same thing of you. Sabbath rest interrupts your work. An aging parent interrupts your schedule. Both force you to stop and give real weight to something that is not producing anything for you this week. Something that does not pay you back on Friday. That is the question hiding under both. Can you honor what cannot repay you? Can you give weight to what has, right now, nothing left to give? Some Jewish tradition pushed even further, grouping the fifth commandment not with the 5 commands about your neighbor, do not steal, do not murder, do not lie, but with the first 4. The ones that deal directly with God. On paper that looks like a filing error, a command about parents shelved next to commands about idols. But read another way, it is a statement. How you treat the 2 people who gave you life is somehow bound up with how you treat the one who gave it through them. The 5th commandment sits on the seam of the whole list, for about God on one side, 5 about people on the other, and holds both sides together with 2 hands. Which brings us to the man who took that seam and drove a knife straight through it. He found a way to look holy while letting a parent starve. And he did it with one word. It happens during an argument about hand washing. The religious teachers have come all the way from Jerusalem to confront Jesus over something small his disciples are eating without the ceremonial rinse their tradition demanded. And instead of defending the crumbs on his disciples' hands, Jesus turns the whole thing around and puts one of their practices under the light. A practice called Corban. Here is how Corban worked. The word means a gift, something dedicated, set apart, consecrated to God for the temple. A man could take his property or his income and declare it Corban. Speak the word over it. And once he did, that money was officially holy. Off limits, which sounds devout, until you notice what it conveniently placed off limits. The ordinary, unglamorous use of feeding his elderly parents. He did not even have to hand the money over to the temple right away. He just had to say the word. And with one religious formula spoken out loud, his obligation to his mother and father evaporated, while the wealth, in practice, stayed right there in his own hands. He got to look generous to God and abandon his parents in the same breath. And do not miss the deepest part of it, because ordinary hypocrisy is not quite what Jesus is exposing. These men had not sneaked around the commandment in the dark. They had climbed over it on a ladder built out of religious language. They used their devotion to God as the very reason for abandoning a parent. God gets the credit, the old couple gets nothing. And the whole maneuver looks, from the outside, like piety. That is greed wearing the robes of worship. Now watch what Jesus does with it, because it is surgical. Before he ever mentions parents, he quotes the prophet Isaiah at these men. This people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. Honor, the same word, aimed at God. And then he pivots and shows them a practice that strips honor away from a father and a mother. 2 failures and 1 word connecting them. Weightless worship on one side, weightless parents on the other. And that word weightless is not decoration. It is the exact opposite of Kabad, the weight word, sitting under both halves of the sentence. Lips producing all the right holy sounds, while the substance has quietly drained out of everything they touch. And Jesus does not soften the landing. He quotes Moses, honor your father and mother, then the harsh companion line about anyone who treats a parent with contempt, and then he says it plainly. You have a fine way of rejecting the commandment of God in order to establish your tradition. Look hard at what that accusation assumes. For the charge to land at all, honoring your father and mother has to mean supporting them materially. Jesus is not complaining that these men forgot to visit or were a little rude on the phone. The charge is financial. Money that should have fed an aging couple got rerouted through a religious loophole, and Jesus calls that a direct violation of the 5th commandment. He put a price tag on the word honor. He made it something you can measure in bread. And Paul says the very same thing, just as bluntly, in a letter to a young pastor named Timothy. Children and grandchildren, he writes, should first learn to make some return to their own family, because this is pleasing in the sight of God. And then he escalates. Anyone who does not provide for his own household has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. That is not a gentle nudge. The earliest Christians understood that caring for your aging parents was part of what it meant to follow Jesus, and that staying religious, while skipping it, was a contradiction serious enough to name out loud. And none of this was new. Aiming that word upward went back centuries. The prophet Malachi opened his book with God confronting priests whose worship had gone lazy and sheep, men bringing blind and lame animals to the altar, offerings they would have been embarrassed to hand their own governor, and calling it good enough for God. And listen to the argument God chooses. A son honors his father, and a servant his master. If then I am a father, where is my honor? That is Kabad again, the weight word. God is taking Israel's own family standard and holding it up to his own face. You already know how a son is supposed to treat the man who raised him. You already know what it looks like to give someone weight. So where is mine? The argument only works because everybody listening already agreed, deep in their bones, that a father is owed honor. It was that settled, that heavy. So let me pull this all the way into your own house for a moment, because you already know this weight. You have just felt it running in a different direction. You know the strange, quiet grief of watching the person who used to decide everything slowly lose the ability to decide anything. The reversal nobody warns you about. There comes a day when you have to take the car keys from the same hands that once drove you to school every single morning, and you have to do it without stripping the person of who they are. There is the fourth telling of the same story in a single afternoon, and the discipline it takes to keep your face from betraying you. There is the paperwork nobody else in the family will touch, the phone calls, the waiting rooms, the slow inversion of a lifetime. That is what weight costs now, not obedience. The daily, unglamorous labor of carrying somebody who once carried you. And that, finally, is where we come back to the man on the wood. Because now you can see it. He is dying. He is Jesus. He is ours, from death, suffocating by inches, carrying the weight of the world's sin on a Roman cross. And below him stands a small cluster of people, and among them is his mother, Mary, almost certainly a widow by now. And in that world, a widow with no son left to support her was one bad season away from destitution, from begging in the road. He was the oldest son, and he was about to be gone. So he looks down at her. Then he looks at the disciple standing beside her, the one he loved. "Woman," he says, "behold your son." And to the disciple, "Behold your mother." And John, who was standing right there, adds the detail, so easy to rush straight past. From that hour, the disciple took her into his own home. That was not a sentiment. It was a transfer of responsibility. In agony, minutes from death, with almost nothing left to give anyone, the Son of God stopped to make sure his mother would eat. He did not hand her off to a brother. He did not leave the arrangement for relatives to sort out later. He did not decide he had bigger things to think about that afternoon, and he was, in the most literal sense the universe has ever known, carrying the bigger thing. He kept the fifth commandment, with some of the last coherent words he would ever speak. He gave his mother weight from the cross. That is the man we started with, and now you know what he was doing. So what does giving weight look like on an ordinary Tuesday? Start with your mouth, because that is where contempt almost always surfaces first. The way you talk about your parents when they are not in the room says far more than the way you talk to them when they are. Complaint is human and sometimes necessary. There is a real difference between telling a friend you are struggling with your father and slowly turning your father into a running joke. One is honesty. The other, sentence by sentence, makes a person light enough to blow away. That is Qalal, the light word, the exact thing the Hebrew put a death sentence on. And you can do it without ever raising your voice. You can do it with a smirk. Then there is money, and there is time, the part Jesus refused to let anyone dodge. For some of you, honor means writing a check. For others, it is the harder currency altogether. Driving over on a free afternoon you would rather have kept. Sitting through the same story a fourth time, without letting your face tell the truth. Handling the paperwork nobody else in the family will touch. That is Corban in reverse. Instead of finding a clever reason the resources are not available, you make them available. And watch out for the modern version of that loophole, because almost nobody today declares their assets consecrated to a temple. But plenty of us keep a schedule, so crowded with genuinely good obligations, that there is nothing left at the end of it, and the parent gets whatever remains. Which is usually nothing. The loophole in Mark's gospel was not crude. It looked respectable, and ours usually does too. But before we close, honesty demands we stop and deal with the hardest case, because it would be a lie to write all of this and step politely around it. Some of you had a father who terrorized you. Some of you had a mother who should never have been trusted with a child. And the Bible does not hand you a rule that requires you to walk back into danger and call it obedience. The prophet Ezekiel is explicit that a child is not bound to carry a parent's guilt or to repeat a parent's pattern. Wisdom is allowed here. Sometimes wisdom looks like distance. In that situation, honor runs quieter and slower and further away, refusing to let bitterness define the rest of your life, declining to speak of them, with contempt to everyone who will listen, praying for a person who never once prayed for you, doing what little can be done safely, from whatever distance keeps you safe, and leaving the rest, all of it, with the God who saw every bit of it, and has not forgotten a single thing. That is honor too. It is just carried a different way, and that points to the ceiling on this commandment, which Scripture is not shy about. Honor was never the same thing as unlimited obedience. Even Jesus, at 12 years old, stayed behind in the temple against his parents' plans and told them he had to be about his Father's business, then went home and lived under them for years anyway. Both things at once. When the authorities later ordered his apostles to stop speaking his name, Peter answered that they had to obey God rather than men, and that principle covers every human authority, parents included. So if your mother tells you to do something God forbids, honor does not mean compliance. You can disagree with your father completely, decline his advice, refuse his opinion outright, and still refuse to make him weightless. You can turn down the counsel and still show up when he needs a ride to the hospital. Those two things have always fit together far more easily than people expect. Now step back and see what God did and did not say. He did not make the command conditional on how good your parents were. He did not attach an escape clause for difficult families, and every family in that camp at the base of the mountain had its share of difficulty. The instruction simply assumes flawed people on both sides and asks for weight anyway. And here, at the very end, is the thing I want you to carry out of this. Every single one of us was carried by somebody before we could walk. Somebody fed you when you could not lift a spoon. Somebody stayed up with you when you could not tell them what was wrong. You did not earn 1 minute of it, and you cannot pay a cent of it back. The fifth commandment is not really asking anything strange at all. It is only asking what happens when the carrying has to go the other direction. When the arms that held you up need holding. When the person who used to decide everything can no longer decide anything. That is the whole of Kabad, in the end, the weight word we started with. Not a feeling, a weight you pick up. Somebody carried you first. One day, if you are given the years, you carry them. So let me ask you the question I actually want you to answer. Who are you carrying right now, and who carried you first? Tell me about them in the comments. Even a name is enough. If this study gave you something worth keeping, subscribe so the next one finds you. And send this one to someone caring for a parent right now, quietly, at cost, with nobody watching, because they may need to hear it more than anyone. God bless you.